Hi everybody. Just going back home after some errands. God, people are driving way too fast. Um, so I wanted to follow up. I mentioned before that I'm currently listening to the audiobook by um, Byron Katie, a woman author from the 1980s, regarding pretty much, and the book is called Loving What Is. It's about deconstructing a lot of the held beliefs that we have about ourselves, about society, about other people, other groups of people, and so on. Because like sometimes we crash out, right? And we say a bunch of stuff that we may not mean or may be in error. So deconstructing helps a lot with that. Whether it's gender issues, racial issues, whatever it may be, personal issues. Like why do I do this or why do I do that? Why do they do that? Can you this? Those kind of stuff, right? So I had mentioned that growing up, by accident, just when I came across Plato's work, the quote that he says, I only know what I know. I only know that I do not know anything, or something like that. I'm forgetting the exact quote. Um, but all I know is I don't know anything. That doesn't sound right. Anyway, point is, it started a process in me where I was like, okay. And then I heard the application in science, the scientific method, and Byron Katie applies the same principle of using questions to deconstruct held beliefs. You know, okay, so that's where that comes from. I mentioned that I started reading it or hearing it on Audible, and today I came on, I think, on chapter two. I need to go back, but I think the questions, the summary, because she uses primarily four. The first step is basically asking yourself um, to go ham on the specific beliefs that you have. And she says, be as nasty as you can. It's going to be on paper. It has to be on paper because you're going to go back for the second part, and third part, and fourth part. And you're going to go one by one. Each point that you talk about, you're going to go over it. Now, I still caution you to listen to the book because she gives great use case examples that are very relatable to everyday life. So that when somebody yells at you, what the hell's wrong with you? That kind of use case. Okay, now she goes on to the second question, which is this true? I think that was what the third question was. Um, and you have to answer yes or no. If there is a but, because, or anything like that, automatically is no. It's automatic no. So you have to go on to question three, which is, are you sure? You're going to come up with another list of more points. You're going to add it back to the original list and going to continue the work in question two. Okay, so it's a wash and repeat. All right. Once you finally get to know, that will unlock a lot of keys. If you keep getting but, because, whatever, you have to repeat the whole cycle. It's step one, question two, question three. What is the problem? Like, what do you have the problem with out of the person? Is it true? Is it really true? When you finally get to know, then and only then, and that's according to her, and that has been my process too, and observation. That was my own process as well. Like I said, had I known that this book had existed from the 80s, and had I overcome already my trauma of only relying on myself, I would have been more open to it. Okay, so please save yourself a lot of headaches. Because for me, it took basically 40 years to get to this place, to get all the emotional tools that I needed. But it went monumentally faster once I accepted the help, and that only happened because I was having panic attacks, and only then did I seek out help with therapy. But whether it's therapy, 12 steps, or this book, they're all the same, but just different approaches. You're deconstructing your held beliefs, right? So that's the key, because a lot of them, it's more to do with your self talk. Search Shad Helmstetter. He goes into what self talk is, and basically in a boiled down way. And Katie says this. It's your held beliefs, like the things you believe to be true, the stories you tell to yourself that you repeat over and over again with each experience that become quote unquote more and more true in your mind. Okay, so that's what you're unpacking, you're deconstructing. Okay, so finally, once you get to know for every single point, then and only then can you get to question four, which again is also my process. Um, so, what is question four? She calls it turning it around or something like that, turning the tables. But bottom line, the question is, does this apply to me? You have to be critically honest. If your knee jerk reaction is no, then go back in your memory and you have to be honest because if because this is going to be very uncomfortable. So a lot of people, and I've noticed this, their body language gives them away, but their default question is no. I have never experienced it. I'm sorry to put it like this, bestie, but that's bullshit. You have. You just don't want to remember in that moment because the answer is uncomfortable. Okay? So once you say yes, and it has to be a yes because often than not it will be a yes, that you also apply because somebody at one time or another called you out on that. They clocked you. So you have to ask if you want to grow and get away from these type of beliefs and have it not hurt you anymore. You have to find the reciprocal hurting point. So if somebody called you that, see how you felt. You know, being called that, right? And then in addition, and that's what she kind of indirectly says, you know, you will start to realize that you're doing the same thing to other people, right? And you see from personal experience that it didn't feel that great. And she goes on to, and I'm still not finished with the book, but it's basically the same observations that I've been seeing over the past 40 years. Um, Once you are honest, critically honest with you, um, and your God, for those of you who are spiritual, because that's part of accountability, part of repenting. Yeah, it's basically the same thing. It's just with different words. But once you get to that point, and you start to be like, I'm being a dick, and you start to kind of subtly change, like when you encounter those same things again, you're like, oh, I already thought about this. Oh, damn. But here's the key: you have to give yourself grace. That's the biggest motivation that will give people for self forgiveness and asking for forgiveness from others. That in 12 steps they talk about this. You cannot ask amends or say sorry because amends is more than just saying sorry. And this goes back to accountability. Same thing, just different name. You cannot be accountable truly if you're going to repeat the same behavior again. Okay? So you cannot repent if you're going to sin again, according to the Christians, right? Same thing, just different name. You can only really repent or be accountable and by combining both of those parts, that you're acknowledging it, which Katie points to, and then you're repenting, like Christians say. You're changing your behavior, which I believe that's her next talking point. I'm not there yet, but it's basically the logical conclusion. And once you accept that you were also wrong, that's your part in the conflict, you will start to see that when you start to apply this to the specific people, and actually that was a breakthrough for me right now, and that's my next step to go through that because I'm going through this in the last 4 days that I've been going into quality time with my mom. We've been kind of fighting a lot because, like I mentioned in other videos, I'm her main care provider, but it's very frustrating that she fights me on several ways, and that's the story I tell myself. But I do have a critical thinking mind, so I recognize that part of it may not even have to do anything with me, but it's still there. Um, and recognizing and being accountable, I recognize that at some point, I don't know when, growing up, not only her, but other people in my life would constantly be discounting me, rolling their eyes, and other attitudes, which I became to believe that they didn't like me, believe me, or whatever. That was the them problem, right? For me, it was the belief that they didn't like me, right? So as a natural result for me, I shut down around certain kinds of people. I would stop asking questions, stop saying anything about my life, my theories about life, anything like that. That was counterproductive for me because it created a void in me for the need to connect. I would rather just shut down than having to deal with dismissive people who would constantly be hurting my feelings. Because even, from the point of view for narcissistic people, which comes again from held beliefs in their way that they're behaving, they're not justifiable because their own um, internal dialogues, their self-talk, is making them behave in that way because they absolutely believe that, but they haven't gone to the point of deconstructing that for themselves, and you cannot really force that issue. Again, I'm not sure who says this. I need to look it up, but basically, the only control you have in life is over yourself, right? So it's kind of pointless to be fighting with the monkeys in their circus when they're not even your monkeys, and you may not even work with monkeys. You may be working with clowns internally, right? So it's kind of weird, kind of illogical to be getting just focusing on that. And I see that personally with me with my mom because it's very frustrating. I recognized a long time ago, by stories of her childhood and how she is, that either she has a problem with misogynists, which has been sort of made implied to me that I'm the only exception, but I, in many ways, do behave like a misogynist. But for me, it's rooted in dismissal, and especially the abuse that I had growing up at the hand of very hurtful ladies and then later girls. I internalized that and was very defensive around those kinds of people. But it's not just them, it's in a universal thing. When people have insecurities, they will take it out on you, right? When you have a light, people will feel threatened by it and they will shut you down in any way they can. That is not a gender issue, that's a universal issue. Um, so, in deconstructing her part of that, which was kind of clashing with mine, for her, she has I keep forgetting to search for this, and that's a story I need to change about me, that I forget things, but I don't. I remember later on at an inopportune time that there's this syndrome or something that individuals, and you see this in a lot in kids, and sometimes they grow out of it, sometimes they don't, where they resent any kind of implied or actual correction. Whenever you give advice or you're yelling at them, especially if you're yelling at them or punishing them in any kind of way, uh, they tend to be defensive by nature. It's kind of just natural. Nobody wants to be yelled at. Nobody wants to be criticized. Nobody, I mean, in a bad way. In a constructive way, that's good. But when they're yelling at you and just yelling you this, that, and whatever, it doesn't feel great. So you want to defend yourself naturally, right? You feel danger. That primitive part of your brain is trying to protect you. But, like a lot of therapists say, it's not really danger. It just feels like it. I mean, there is some circumstances where it can escalate to that point, but for the majority of issues, it's just that fear that's kicking in. But as higher thinking beings, we have control over that. So we kind of have to deconstruct those beliefs on a constant basis to make sure that they're not getting bottled up. The other part of it that I've been working on, about a year ago, I came across a content creator that mentioned one thing, that for those of us who were traumatized with abandonment issues or similar kind of issues, we ended up relying on ourselves. That happened to me, and I realized that a long time ago. My first crystal memory about this was when I was 6 years old. I was being taken care of by a babysitter. The teenage boy of the landlord lived, and he used to like to make pranks. I didn't know at that age until basically this year that the way that the lock mechanism was on our door, there was no way that it could have been locked from the outside. But I remember being locked in the room and then couldn't open. Now flashing back, the only locking mechanism was the chain, and that was high enough that it was impossible for me to have set it. Somebody was holding the door, but I didn't realize that for so many years. But it caused so much pain in me that I was in such a desperate situation that nobody came to my help. And luckily, though, the configuration of our room was next to a shared bathroom for the entire house. So I picked the lock, at such a young age, at the age of 5, 6 years old, and my bed was a twin. At first I couldn't move it, so I got angry, and I used all that adrenaline, I guess, to move the bed out of the way. Unfortunately, it caused a consequence that I associated anger with overcoming obstacles. And as I keep growing up, and this memory was a core memory, every time I remembered back, and I guess I just realized this year, but I would never really consciously say this part until recently, that it wasn't so much the anger part that pushed me to associate and reinforce that behavior. It was the success and pride in knowing that I did something by myself. So every time I encountered that, my approach was get angry or be proactive. Both of those things were natural results of that. But it never occurred to me that there was more than one way to get the energy to be able to overcome things. The proactive part stuck with me, and eventually I realized that that's what was going on, right? But this self-talk kept growing over the years, and every time that I realized I was causing harm to myself, I would go through these cycles of deconstructing, trying to analyze what was going on, and unwittingly I was suppressing emotions. I wasn't feeling my emotions because of that, and because I took to heart the axiom growing up, the show must go on. So I didn't give myself the space to feel the feelings that I need, which needed to feel in that moment, which is key too. Why? Because part of healing is also taking care of yourself, right? So part of it is forgiving yourself and forgiving others for doing similar things to you or around you that cause pain to you, because sometimes they don't even realize that they're doing this kind of behavior. It happened with me growing up. I was very close with my mom for my first 10 years of life. My older siblings were in Mexico. They were the first to come here when I was around 11 years old, but that caused a lot of conflicts because by then it was just me and my mom. I didn't know how to process that because nobody was around. My mom worked all the time back then, and I didn't have the best of examples. Where I lived was a LGBT house like those in on the East Coast, but it was not ideal for kids. So from that point of view, I do kind of agree with the more conservative side. There's just some things that kids shouldn't be exposed to. And plus, given that a lot of people in the LGBT community are not accepted and some are thrown out at a very young age, what can you expect? And it's not their fault. Absolutely not. I've encountered a lot of these things too. When it comes to dating, my mom has absolutely no way of helping me. So growing up, I couldn't go to her. My culture particularly, the F word and similar words were a punchline. So I didn't feel comfortable to come out to anybody until I was confronted by my mom at 21. That's when I was about to turn 21, actually, because my 21st birthday was basically my coming out birthday as well. So there you go. I really didn't have much recourse because every time, once my family started to come, I didn't have anybody to be my example, really. And these people that were in this LGBT house had backgrounds where a lot of them were kicked out at a young age, or they moved out, to preserve their own minds. But unfortunately, they hadn't picked up the interpersonal skills that they needed. So what they were doing around each other, and for the landlord, she was passing on some unhealthy habits to their kids. And unfortunately, I was kind of, a bystander because of that. Because even the behavior of the kids were kind of rooted in some issues, aside of natural tendencies of character, you know. So all that wasn't their conscious fault. It just happened to happen. Then when my family came here, my mom, my grandma, who was the matriarch of our family, the way that things turn out in our family for the past three generations, and in other parts of Mexico, especially during the Mexican Revolution, a lot of men died or came during the 70s to the U.S. under the Bracero program. So it was only a lot of single mothers that were really married, but were basically behaving as single mothers because really they didn't have the support structure. And in our family in particular, things were aggravated because our local mailman, back then they used to send money through telegram, which was delivered by the mailman. Our particular mailman was unscrupulous and stole money that people over here would send. That caused problems with my grandma, which caused problems to be passed on to my mom's siblings, which caused problems to be passed on to us. Okay, so having all that put into mind, I realized at some point, uh, logically speaking, but I was still missing one piece. It's deconstructed all of that, but I realized one thing, that it was not their fault. That their lives were so messed up because of all this happening. They had this generational trauma passed on to them. So a lot of them didn't really have the emotional toolkit to remedy their own problems, right? So up to the point that my grandma started to age. My grandma took care of everything. She was the matriarch. That's how it ran in our family. um, and once she split up from my grandpa because of the root cause of this mailman and other issues. um, the fallout was the children, right? So my older siblings were also impacted by this because my grandma was raising them and she was dealing with her own crises. Okay, so once my siblings came here and other people in the family, like my uncles and third party issues through like my cousins, my aunt and uncle in Mexico City asked my mom to help with my cousin who was going through a tough time, and they were afraid that he was going to get into bad things. So my mom accepted. She brought him over. He was going through his things, and they were serious stuff. Unfortunately, though, again, I was a innocent bystander. Why? Because in terms of my older cousin and the cousin that's my age, only older by 1 month, they were going through things that tipped on the down the wrong path. Let me just put it that way. And so to save me, my mom, deciding without even talking to me about it, told them to stay away from me. That was one consequence. Another consequence was that because everybody was such a mess and my grandma was getting on in years, the uncles and my mom talked together that, hey, lay off of your grandma, of your mother, or grandma if it was one of the kids. Let's talk to, Mario's mom. Mario is me. So constantly, and I think this was that they weren't realizing this, and if they hear this, I'm not blaming you. I'm just saying that this was a natural consequence of, all this stuff going on. So I'm not mad in that respect. I got mad and got destructive because, I felt like I wasn't getting the same courtesy extended to me when I was going through my stuff. So growing up, I was very close with my mom my first 10 years, but that changed drastically when people started to come over. They started to go to my mom for pretty much everything. Instead of having the critical thinking that they needed, that was not passed down to them. My mom pretty much admits to this point. Um, they didn't know what they didn't know. So they would recourse to my mom as almost an automatic. At least they didn't give an indication of being proactive. That's been kind of made clear in many ways. And I can debate that. But, I mean, that could be a story that I'm telling myself. I don't know. But the result was still the same. It doesn't matter what the reasoning was or the intent. The result was still the same. And that was my point when I got into it with some family members that, took it the wrong way. It wasn't their fault. It was just a fallout of all this generational crap, right? So what would happen every time that I would go growing up, that I would be talking with my mom just about every time, if not most times, or when I was in a critical point of talking something very important, I was building up to it or was in the middle of it. And instead of, being asked, me and my mom holding the boundary that this time is important between me and my son, my youngest son, that she didn't put the boundaries up saying, hey, can you come back later? Or is this important? Which later realized as an adult, that's what I needed. And that's what caused my own abandonment trauma issues, that I didn't get that kind of validation because it wasn't even in my mom's radar. She assumed because I was so smart as an adult, and she repeated it this past weekend. that she just automatically assumed. And that's one thing that I really beg you guys, that if somebody appears to be smart, it's not that they're smart necessarily, but that they may have two things that I have: really close attention. Like in my case, it was hyper awareness. In order to keep myself, because I had convinced myself that I was basically in it on my own, that I had to figure out shit. I came up with a game plan that I had to be 10 steps ahead to be able to resolve these kinds of issues. So I would basically do a contingency plan. That's what it basically comes down to contingency plans. Uh, Normal people would call it, people who don't like, snobbish, or, more complicated words. I was worrying, but at the same time, I was being proactive. So I was coming up with these solutions. Constantly I was in my head. When somebody insulted me, and I didn't come up with a quick back, because that would happen to me all the time, especially in my family. They would, make jokes at my expense. I understand where it comes from, culturally speaking, but it hurt nonetheless. So at some point, I got to the point of, basically chewing them out in my brain, and got so good at clapbacks, at, reading them like a book, insulting them back, being, that kind of passive aggressive. And I did become passive aggressive to some extent. Um, so all those were, consequences of both the trauma and the default of how to deal with things. But bottom line, it was deconstructing that was helping me. It was helping in a negative way, because the root was that I had the belief also that anger gets things done. But there's other solutions that I've come to learn as an adult. Like, a perfect example of how to deal with this in a diplomatic way, but still kind of setting your boundaries and kind of borderline letting them know I bite. Look at Designing Women. The character, Julie, I think. Julia Fairchild, something like that. She's the one who would always basically chew out somebody in a respectful way. She basically used, you know, um, respectful words, but very harsh words. She was very blunt, but she would always get her point across. She would give people ego deaths. So I learned that as a template for myself, as doing that. Eventually, I got good enough to be able to give clapbacks almost instantly, but that caused, and through analyzing myself, doing deconstructing, I noticed something without anybody telling me, that I was making people alienated from me. Every time I got them and destroyed their ego, they just didn't want to be around me, because they were fearing that if they said something the wrong way, I would clap back and knock them on their ass, metaphorically speaking. That was unproductive, it was unhealthy, it was toxic. I recognize that as an adult, but in this deconstructing, I came across all this. All right, I'm home now. I'm gonna take a break, and I'll come back later, and hopefully put it with this as a third part, because it looks like so far I have about two parts. I'm recording this outside of TikTok, and we'll need to edit it. But anyway, I'll be back.